So, chapter 6 of our text was all about research ethics, and this does have a lot of overlap with the work that you're doing to get your city training. So, the first part of the chapter talked about different areas of research ethics that researchers need to think about. So, the first one is the relationship between society and science. So, here the authors were talking about how what researchers study is based on what society thinks is important, and also relates to what I'm going to talk about on the next slide about our biases and what we value and how this impacts the focus and the data that's collected. And this is also related a lot to the grants that are offered and received. So that is something that is definitely important for ethics, is to think about what we study, what gets studied, what is financed, etc. So the next area of concern was related to professional issues. So they talked about fraudulent activity. Of course, falsifying data is definitely an ethical concern in all types of research. And then about the publication issues, they talked about duplicating your results in different publications. Of course, that's not something that we're going to necessarily be concerned about with this class, but these are for researchers who are publishing in journals and carrying out research, and even especially if they are doing research that is for a grant or for an institution, those are some ethical concerns that researchers should be mindful of. And then the majority of the chapter was spent talking about the treatment of participants, which again is the focus of your city training. So, as far as the treatment for participants, here are some of the guidelines in the chapters that they talked about. And the chapter does a great job defining all of these terms and giving some examples of each of those. So, when researchers are doing participants with people, whether it be children, adults of any kind, and it could be a qualitative study or a quantitative study, any research that involves people, even if it's just their test scores or data about them, it's super important that researchers are mindful of the ethics and respecting people's rights and making sure that the research is ethical. So one of those is freedom to withdraw. So it's important that even if someone agrees to participate in a study, that they understand and are allowed to change their mind at any time. So that's something that's important to think about when you are planning your procedures, your data collection procedures. How will you make sure that participants understand and have the ability to withdraw? Of course, protection from mental and physical harm. So in educational research, there typically isn't much physical harm, but there is a lot of potential for mental harm. And the chapter gives a couple anecdotes about some examples with that and how researchers took the time to go back and revise some of their procedures and their instruments to make them more ethical and to make sure that they are thinking about the impact on participants' mental well-being. And so related to that mental and physical harm, and the physical harm too can be related to privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity. So in much research, in order to be anonymous, that means that the researcher does not know who the participants is. They don't know any identifying information. And that can be a very difficult bar to attain when you're designing research. So most research focuses on confidentiality, where the researcher takes great lengths to make sure that they are protecting participants' identity. So things like using a pseudonym, things like keeping identifiable information stored separately from the data. And that's also related to privacy, making sure that they keep all private information like participants' email address, or phone number, identifiable information like that, keeping that private and stored separately. So one of the practices, especially as we're in the digital age now, one of the practices that researchers do to ensure both privacy and confidentiality is to be very mindful and think about where they will store data. So before even collecting data, when they are getting approval from the institutional review board that you also read about in this chapter, they have to explain who will collect the data, where it will be stored, and it needs to be stored in a password protected file that only the research team has access to. And also it's best practices to store identifiable information separate from the data in either different drives, different password protected files, is a way to go about doing that. So another area has to do with deception. So I know that it looks like it's under, but it's actually 1, 2, 3, well, and 4. So another area is deception. So with deception, sometimes, and it's fairly common when researchers are collecting data, they don't want to tell the participants exactly the purpose of the study. If they are trying to figure, because if they might not want to use what's called the placebo effect. So they know that by telling the participants that exactly what they are doing, that could impact the validity of the data that they're collecting. So sometimes researchers design studies that involve deception. And what that means is that the participants don't know exactly the purpose or the function of a particular instrument or survey that's being used. So if that's the case, and again, this has to get approval. So that's one check that we have in research is we have the institutional review board. So researchers design studies, they try to uphold the principles of ethics, but then they send it to the institutional review board at universities or other research agencies. And so a team reviews it and gives a second opinion to make sure that it meets the institution standards for ethics. So if it's approved to use deception, participants might need debriefing afterwards. So dehoaxing is the process of revealing the true intent of the study and addressing the deception that was used. And then desensitizing, that can be used both with deception and then also if there's studies that involve some type of mental harm, where you offer some type of support for any issues that may have arose during the study topic. So any type of sensitive issues that are being studied, researchers need to make sure that they have planned and thought about how they will support participants, both before, during, and after the study. Another approach that wasn't included in this chapter, but is often used by researchers with ethical standards is to do what's called member checking. So some researchers design their study to where, let's say that, then this is most typically used in qualitative studies. So if they have done interviews with participants, they will do things like send the interview transcript to participants and allow participants to review it and make sure it's accurate. And then also too, once the researcher has done the analytic process with the coding and looking for themes, sending that to their participants to get their participants' opinion about whether or not that accurately represents what they were trying to convey. So member checking is another technique to increase the ethics and help make sure that you are decreasing harm to participants. And then, as I mentioned here, with the freedom to withdraw, so in ethical research, participants have to consent to participating. And so the institutional review board will also approve the informed consent. I should have included an example here, but I'll try to drop that in next week. So I'll show you that next week, an example of an informed consent form that we use at Georgia State. But the chapter does go through what's typically included in informed consent. So informed consent, it's important that it is written in a reading level that your participants have access to, and that it is written in a way that is very fair, clear, straightforward, and not confusing. So deception would not be used in an informed consent form unless it was approved by the board. the institutional review board. And the informed consent must say that it's voluntary. It will tell the participants what the potential benefit is and then what the potential harms are. And it also makes clear that participants can change their mind at any time and withdraw from the study at any time. If you're doing research with children, you have to be age 18 to consent. So if you are doing research with children, you will get consent from their parents, and then you get what's called assent from the children. And that's where children agree, either verbally or written, to participate. It's not considered assent because consent because they are minors. So if it's with children, it's an extra step of not only getting consent from the parent, but also assent from the child as well. And then the chapter talked about passive versus active consent. And I'm curious what your thoughts. The chapter did mention that some researchers think that passive consent is unethical. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, passive versus active consent. Do you think that there is a role for passive consent? And do you think passive consent is ethical at all? And if so, why and when? And then in order for research to be considered ethical, the benefits need to outweigh the risks. So in research, there are risks to participants, and in educational research, it's often the mental harm from talking about sensitive topics or potential breaches of confidentiality. So all research does have risks to participants. So it's important that researchers and institutional review boards are weighing those risks with the potential benefits of the study. So over here, these are some benefits, and over here, these are some risks. So some of the benefits are it could have increased educational understanding, could be a new skill that's learned, a new treatment. Sometimes participants are given money or a gift, or sometimes it actually benefits the participants by giving them this treatment or educational skill, and sometimes just the help, the satisfaction from helping. And then some of the risks, it could be psychological harm, stress, threats to confidentiality or privacy, and then the psychological stress of having deception. So when you are writing your research proposal, you will discuss the ethical considerations of your study. So I'm also curious, you can leave a comment if you're so inclined. What are the potential risks or ethical concerns that you have about your study? Okay, and here's the question for you here, if you want to look at it. So in your research proposal, you will discuss the ethical considerations. So of course, you'll have your research purpose, your background, your literature review. You'll talk about the participants, your design. And then here, this is where you're talking about the ethics. So would you propose to offer any incentives to your participants? And then what are the risks and benefits to participants? And so you can reference you can reference the list that I provided here when you're starting to think about some risks and benefits to your participants. And then privacy and confidentiality. What steps will you take to ensure that identifiable information or personal information like phone numbers, email addresses of your participants are maintained? And then confidentiality, how will you protect their identities? So if you want in perusal, go ahead and discuss some of the ethical considerations that are related to your particular research topic that you are planning to do for your research proposal. Now, the next thing that I wanted to talk about is researcher positionality. Now, this wasn't included in this chapter explicitly. This could be included a little bit under the settings of the ethical concerns related to research and science and society, but I wanted to talk a little bit about this. So researcher positionality is related to the researcher's identity. All of us come to research with our background, all of our previous experiences that shapes our world worldview. So this chart here just makes visual what researcher positionality means, all the different components of our identity and our experiences, how that impact how we view the world and experience the world and the issues that we even know about. So this is related to researcher bias and our positionality. So in my opinion, this is a very important component of ethics and research too, is being aware and making clear what our positionality is and how this impacts the research that we are collecting. And that when we're transparent about that, in my opinion, it makes the research higher quality because people who read our research are able to critique the research based on what we've already shared about our positionality. And they're able to analyze what we've stated and then hold us accountable. Have we risen to the bar that we hope to in navigating our positionality as we collect, plan, and analyze the data? So this is something that I think is very important, and I wanted to share this example. So especially when you're doing critical research, it's so important to think about the impact of positionality and how bias might impact studies. So this is an example of a research study that in my opinion, didn't meet the ethical expectations in terms of interrogating researcher positionality and bias and led to some problematic research results. So this research question was about so this research was addressing some of the problems that have come up. So this researcher noticed a lot of biases in health research, a lot of racial biases about pain. And so this is an issue that is really serious in the medical field and has led to some very serious outcomes. So this researcher carried out this study to analyze bias in research about pain based on race and how that impacts treatment. So in this study, the researcher, they did a survey of medical school students to understand their perceptions about differences in pain. And so as you can see, these not doctors yet, but medical school students had a lot of racial biases in their beliefs about pain. So as you can see, some beliefs like Black skin is thicker than white skin, things like they have stronger immune systems. So a lot of these stereotypes and biases lead to problems in the medical field. And so when these biases are not explicitly stated and interrogated, that can lead to unethical practices, as we see in the medical field today with inequities along race, with how pain medication is distributed and how pain is dealt with. Issues like Black mortality rate for Black maternal mortality rates. So that's something that is an ethical concern that must be also included. So here are some questions that I would encourage you to consider when you're planning your study. So how do those in power create problems? So when you are evaluating research and planning your own research, interrogate that. How is power being placed here? And then what can be done to address oppressive systems, such as what this researcher took on in this study here. And then the last example that I wanted to share with you is the US Public Health study, their syphilis study. So this is often called the Tuskegee syphilis study. So many of you might know about this study. So this study is an example of unethical research and some of the widespread damage that can be caused by unethical research. So the USPS syphilis study was a 40-year study that was conducted from 1932 to 1972. And this study was focused on understanding how syphilis, understanding how the disease of syphilis progressed. And so this study was conducted in a rural part close to Tuskegee, and the participants were low income African American, mostly farmers. And so they were offered a lot of incentives to participate, like healthcare, free meals, treatment outside of syphilis. And so there were a lot of incentives to participate. However, there were many, many ethical problems. There was no informed consent. There was deception used. So one of the main areas of deception was around the purpose of the study. So participants were never told the exact purpose of the study. They were just told that it was to look at blood issues and not specifically syphilis. And so in the study, there were about 600 participants. 4 of them had syphilis, 4 of them did not. But another serious concern that came up was that, so the study started in 1932, but in 1943, penicillin was identified as a treatment for syphilis. And so the participants in the study were never told about the treatment, and the treatment was withheld from participants. And the study went on for 40 years, and the only thing that stopped the study was a news piece in 1972 that found out about that this was happening and published an article about it. And then through that public outcry, the study was ended. However, the damage still impacts us today. So from this study, 128 of the participants died because they were withheld the treatment of penicillin. And more than that, not only that, many of their partners and spouses were infected with syphilis, and children as well. At least 40 partners and at least 20 children were also infected. So this, and this sort of relates to everything that I'm trying to share about researcher positionality bias. Clearly, this research had disregard for the identity of the participants that they included. And so that, along with failing to meet some of those ethical principles, we have this serious result. So even though this study ended several years ago, many years ago, the effects are still around today. And so I wanted to share with you this video from some researchers at Stanford, and they are planning a current study to look at how the impact of this Tuskegee syphilis study, how that impacts our society today. So I am going to go ahead and share that with you now.
I'm a physician here in the Oakland community, and I do clinical research.
My name is Marcella Alshon. I'm an assistant professor at CHP Corps, and I have a background in both medicine and economics.
I'm Javarsi. I'm a sophomore here at Stanford. I'm most likely majoring in biology, but currently expecting to go to med school.
We started a pilot study, which is examining some of the factors that get Black men in particular to seek preventative health care.
This notion that trust is important, trust in institutions is very important, I think that's very relevant, and it takes a long time to build it back up.
One of the big factors are historical abuses, and the most well-known and probably the most egregious historical abuse is the U.S. Public Health Service study of syphilis around Tuskegee, Alabama.
And what had happened was for 4 decades, from 1932 to 1972, they specifically targeted Black men in the South who had very little education and followed them even though they had a treatment for syphilis and watched them as the disease progressed.
One of the big things I remember always being emphasized growing up is the huge gap in life expectancies between African American populations and Caucasian populations, specifically between white and Black men.
It had been written about for a long time that might have actually had an effect on the trust that particularly those men, had in the institutions of public health, in medicine. We just took that hypothesis seriously, and we dug around, myself and my co-author, Marianne Wanamaker from the University of Tennessee, to actually see if that hypothesis held water. And we found that it did.
So those are some of the things we're trying to determine. What are the real factors behind African American male mistrust or distrust of the healthcare system? So we first started working in barbershops, and we went to barbershops to recruit black men. If you know anything about the black barbershop, everyone, if you need to get your hair cut and you're a black guy, whether you're rich or poor, a PhD, or didn't finish high school, you go to the same barbershop that is part of your community.
I think as the black barbershop, we're somewhat looked to as the pillar of the community. So we take on the responsibility of helping the black man's well-being.
I would definitely say I love my experience in the barbershop. I think one thing that I really got a feel for is like the many facets of the communities, especially specifically the even African American male communities within Oakland.
One thing we learned was just how much weight the Stanford brand has, and how I think happy people were that we were interested and involved with their struggles.
We have limited access to healthcare opportunities.
We would really leave this kind of bubble that we're in and really go down and see some of the challenges people were facing financially, economically, socially.
Me personally, I've had bad experiences with the medical system, with the criminal justice system. So a few years ago I was shot, and I wasn't necessarily treated the way that I would have liked, right? And one thing that I noticed and one thing that I didn't see is people that look like me, and which instantly put me in a state of vulnerability.
Because a lot of minorities, they don't seek health care for many reasons, whether they're scared or they just don't know. But with me being in the face of the shops, recruiting is kind of like, oh hey, this guy, you know, it's just kind of like, it's a connection.
This is a bigger problem than just in my community, because throughout this research project, we were able to meet folks from Africa, we were able to meet folks from different states, and it's a common problem throughout this nation, right, throughout the world.
So Dr. Alston and I hope to uncover a few things. One, what are some of the factors that either get black men to seek preventative health care, or to prevent them from seeking preventative health care? So if we know that, if we look at the positive side, we can maybe impact policy or work with institutions like a Stanford or a Sutter Health to design systems that reinforce some of those positive aspects.
Hopefully the sound was okay for that. I'm also going to put the link in the chat and perusal for the Stanford site. So if you couldn't hear well, hopefully you paused and you can click there to view it. So in the next part of the assignment, we have the review slides from chapter 6. And then in the next part, the discussion questions, and then finally some multiple choice topics. So I look forward to reading your insights and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.